walking in, there was folks flying the big Freedom Convoy flags. I walked in, one of the first flags I saw, I tweeted about it. In the house, in the arena, was a big Trump 2024 flag.
Yeah, I heard the horns.
Elicited, lots
at
of horns.
6:30 last night.
Lots of people sort of cheering with the Trump stuff. You saw a few American flags. That stuff kind of drives me nuts, but I understand why, and I've got relatives in the States, and we love the States, so it's great, but you understand what I'm saying. And then, like I said, kind of the who's who. So this Rachel Emmanuel gal gets up. She's from True North, that outlet that was founded by Candace Malcolm and them. I mean, I'm talking about kind of name dropping the who's who of the right wing in Canada. Rachel Emmanuel also happens to be David Parker's wife, the Take Back Alberta founder that was on our show a couple of months ago. So she comes up and, whether you like her perspective or not, she had a couple real zingers out of the gates.
Like what?
She said, Rachel Notley is so afraid that Tucker Carlson's coming to Alberta that she resigned. And that got a pretty, I laughed. I thought that was pretty funny. There were some good lines in there. There was obviously a very sort of a conservative friendly crowd. You know what you're getting into, and lots of people that were, like I said, just I think curious to see what one of the biggest media stars in the world would do live and what he would have to say. So John Carpe introduces him, and Danielle Smith's up there as well. Smith takes the stage to just absolute raucous applause.
Really?
Standing ovation, brings the house down. She comes in, Alberta's premier does, and she starts talking about freedom of speech, and not in the sense that she had tweeted about, I think, where she was like, everybody should be able to talk to everybody else, and free speech means having conversations with, check this out, for example, she tweets this photo from Calgary yesterday, says free speech means you don't just have to talk to the mainstream media. Finished up in Calgary, off to Edmonton next, and there she is posing for a photo with psychologist and author Jordan Peterson, with Tucker Carlson and with Conrad Black, founder of the National Post.
What a photo!
What a photo, right? Look at the people go, why did Danielle Smith do this? Why would she do this? Well, I don't know.
Million.
Let's take a look at the analytics on the tweet. 1.2 million views, 17,000 likes. I mean, this is her crowd, and it's a friendly crowd. So she gets up there, and I think a lot of people there last night were wondering to see when the crazy would happen, or what would be that moment where it just kind of went off the rails.
Sure.
And spoiler alert, there was not one of those moments.
Okay.
There were some things that were said. Some of them were kind of like subtle little things that were said where you went, but there was not sort of one moment where you went, oh, wow.
Okay.
Alberta's premier comes in. She starts talking about, freedom of speech. She indicates that she believes that cancel culture is a problem, in particular on university campuses. I think that a lot of people would probably share the premier's view that there is not a robust or an environment of robust intellectual discovery or exploration on university campuses as much as there should be. So I don't think that that's a particularly controversial statement. She talked about how Stephen Guilbeault, she really wanted Tucker Carlson, she said, to shine a light on Stephen Guilbeault, and he didn't either. But boy, did he have a lot to say about the federal Liberals. Not a lot about Guilbeault, but boy, that guy does not like Justin Trudeau nor Chrystia Freeland. I'll tell you that much.
Did he call him a dictator?
That was the nicest thing he called him. Smith talks a little bit about how they want to, Guilbeault, the feds, Ottawa, want Alberta to dial back its oil and gas production. She says, we're going to double it. The crowd goes nuts. And then, she shares a few more thoughts about why she thinks that the event is important, and then concedes the stage for John Carpe. John Carpe introduces Tucker Carlson, and all hell breaks loose. People go nuts. The guy is obviously a very dynamic speaker. He's extremely talented. He's very funny.
He's an entertainer.
He had the crowd absolutely eating out of his hand. He said some curious things. Here's one example. And people will say, well, what's the context or what's the whatever? But I'm just giving you a little example. So he said something like, you'll have to pardon me, I'm very polite. He said, I'm an Anglo. As an Anglo in my nature, it's in my nature to be polite. Okay. And you kind of go, okay, hang on a second. What does that mean? There were like these tiny little comments, but he was firing on all cylinders, taking aim at the federal government, calling Justin Trudeau a creep, calling him a cross-dressing freak, calling him a communist dictator, wondering when he's moving back to Cuba. He says, if I was Canadian, he divulged last night, by by the way, that his father's family is from Nova Scotia or spent time in Nova Scotia. So he said he does have some Canadian blood, but he said, if I'm Canadian, I don't know about you, but I'm running Trudeau's name through the 23andMe website that figures out your ancestry. The crowd goes wild. Of course, this whole thing around the conspiracy theory that Justin Trudeau is actually Fidel Castro's love child. You know that whole story, right? Carlson spent some time talking about trans people, which was probably the most pointed and I don't know if I want to use the word venomous, but it was probably the most like full guns blazing attack mode that he went into. But he spent a very short period of time talking about it.
What did he say?
He said that he's never met a trans person that has actually been happy after, in his words, and the way that he put it, sort of a self-initiated castration, right? And like genital mutilation is how he referred to it. People would call it gender transition surgery or gender reassignment surgery. But the trans thing kind of landed with the crowd in a way that I found some people that had been applauding big time throughout kind of were reserving their applause, and other people were going nuts about it because that's kind of, I think, part of what they were expecting to hear and wanting to hear. He spent a ton of time talking about the Alberta relationship with Ottawa.
Sure.
I bet that people, a lot of the people were surprised, or maybe not, at his depth of commentary on what's happening in Canadian politics. Like, he was hitting on so many things, and this is the mark of a good speech writer, and this is the mark of a great performer.
Do you think he has people who help him?
Oh, I'm sure he does.
Write his stuff?
I'd be curious to know. Certainly when he had his show, he would have had speech writers.
Yeah.
He's obviously a very intelligent person. I was talking to a journalist that was there last night, and she said to me, the thing I can't wrap my mind around it is that he's this right-wing icon that dresses kind of like a left-wing Ivy League preppy. She said he's so very cool. He's so very critical of the Ivy League schools from where he graduated. She was trying to wrap her mind around his presentation, which is obviously very curated. He had his like navy blazer on with his khaki pants, his signature striped tie. That's the Tucker Carlson look. Just obviously, talked about how he thought that, the feds, how the Trudeau government, the Liberal government in Canada, he said, is just an embarrassment. And he said, and we know what happens with governments like this is ultimately the people rise up and remove them from power. And people loved comments like that, statements like that. He talked about Justin Trudeau's blackface several times. Obviously, the crowd loved that stuff. But he really, really had hand grenades reserved for Chrystia Freeland. Talked about how he knew her back when she was a journalist for the Financial Times. He said that publication will forever have to own the embarrassment of once employing her. She thinks she's much smarter than she is. He called her a fascist midget. The crowd went nuts when Tucker Carlson referred to Canada's deputy prime minister as a fascist midget. But I mean, had people, like I said, on the edge of their seats, delivered a keynote for probably about a half an hour. And then
that was it.
Welcome to the stage for the panel, Jordan Peterson and Conrad Black. And then the three of them chewed the fat. Depending on who you talk to on that panel, I felt like it's interesting to hear someone like Jordan Peterson in person. He was very ethereal. He was very Peterson kind of was retreating into his own thoughts, burying his, he had his legs tightly crossed.
He goes off.
He had his head kind of in his hands. It almost looked like the wheels were turning and he was gathering himself before his next diatribe or his next statement. Conrad Black kind of waxing poetic. Black is up there in his own words as the biggest Trump supporter in Canada. He says, I have a track record of proving that I am the biggest Trump supporter in Canada. Went on to say, did the founder of the National Post, Lord Black, that it's probably because I've known Trump, he says, for 25 years. And when I ran into my own legal trouble, said Conrad Black, he said, most of my wealthy friends or my friends with influence developed amnesia and forgot my phone number. He said Donald Trump did not.
Wow.
But Conrad Black really got into kind of the election denialism, talking about how ballots, millions of ballots were dropped off in the middle of the night, on the side of the road beside post offices, and people started booing and this kind of stuff. That wasn't something that Carlson really latched onto, which I thought was interesting. But all in, it was I would say 8,000 to 10,000 people hearing from some of the most prominent conservatives in the world.
So it wasn't full.
Prominent right-wingers in the world. What's that?
It wasn't full, sold out.
Well, I don't think that they wouldn't have opened the upper deck. So if you picture a hockey arena, if you want to put that photo up that I snapped on my phone again, like a fisheye photo for people listening on the podcast, you can see, the upper deck is blacked out, but the entire lower bowl and the floor was full. But that's a hell of a turnout for something that's not hockey or a rock concert. I did hear, and Tucker Carlson, to his credit, man, during the show gave a shout out to the people who showed up for the free tickets. And then this whole area, started cheering, which I thought was interesting. Like he just was like, yeah, a lot of, they got it to full because they gave away some free tickets, which I liked the transparency there. But I think most of the people there were paid ticket goers. I didn't get any sense and that's not a surprise that a guy like Tucker Carlson could sell out a 10,000 seat arena,
especially here in Alberta.
Yeah, I had an inkling that we would hear from some real talkers that were there, and I'm glad that Aaron and Kyle took us up on our offer to pass along their thoughts. Aaron says, other than my disappointment that Rex Murphy was not there, she says, I really wanted to hear his ridiculous out loud. That was the greatest thing, she said, seeing Tucker Carlson. She says, here's my uneducated, uncouth synopsis. Go easy on yourself, Aaron. Here's something that Aaron touches on, something that Danielle Smith said twice from the podium that I thought was interesting. She congratulated Edmonton Police Chief Dale McPhee. She specifically recognized him. And I thought she was going to say for quick action with the shooting at Edmonton City Hall, right? Like this is like 28 hours after that happened, maybe 30 hours after that happened. But no, she was congratulating him and his officers on swift action with the homeless encampments in Edmonton. Ooh. But that's not what she called them. The premier had a name for it, obviously a formulated strategic name for these encampments. And I'll give it to Erin because she writes in her email. She says, what was up with Danielle Smith talking about gang-operated drug camps? That was the 4 words that, and I even text, I text things to myself, Johnny, so I don't forget them on the show. I texted that to myself when she said it. Gang-operated drug camps. It has been alleged by credible people to us, to politicians, to other, people of record in Alberta that there are gang-operated homeless encampments, that cartels are running some of these camps and some terrible things are happening. I believe that to be true. I think that characterizing them as gang-operated across the board may not be accurate, but I think that is a fair play for a politician that's trying to make a point. Calling them drug camps, I think is troublesome because it's obviously misrepresenting what a lot of people are experiencing there and why a lot of people are there.
Yeah, they're not churning out drugs. They're addicted to drugs.
And it's not a camp established for people to go do drugs. They're not there to replace a supervised consumption site. It's not all drug users there. We heard from, we remember when we talked to Brandy Morin, the journalist, I think it was about 2 weeks ago when she was arrested. She gave us an exclusive interview. You can find it in our archives no longer than 2 weeks ago. Brandy told us that there's an entire indigenous camp that was dry, an entire indigenous camp that was being run by a gentleman and by an elder that has been living a life of sobriety for many, many years, and that was the tone that they had set in that camp. But I'll get back to Erin's email. She says, what was up with Smith and the gang-operated drug camps? She says she said it 2 or 3 times and then says, bless the police. Then John Carpe comes on from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and basically says, like, fuck the police, which he did, in the context of, like, Christian pastors being arrested and all this kind of stuff, right? Jordan Peterson's message says Aaron was basically walked toward Catholicism. There was a lot of sort of theological, psychological musing from who you might expect it to be from, Jordan Peterson. She says Tucker came across as reasonable and rational for like a minute until he realized that wasn't what paid his bills. She said, I was also struck by his assertion that safe supply means that we are feeding young people fentanyl in Canada. He really sunk his teeth into that. He talked about how Canada is basically giving fentanyl to children without the knowledge of their parents. And people start booing, and I'm sitting there going, that's not true at all. And then he started talking about MAID. He started bringing up medical assistance in dying and talking about how the federal government is basically using it for population control. He talked about supply and demand and how the fewer votes you have, the more valuable the votes are. And medical assistance in dying is being extended to people simply because they're sad. or because they're destitute, not because they're in pain. And hey, there are some concerns around medical assistance in dying. There are some concerns on how people with mental health challenges are accessing that system, or why some people in desperation, including poverty, may be looking to medical assistance in dying. We should not simply flush that argument away. But of course, he took it all the way to the max. And that made an impression on Erin as well, so much so that she wrote it into her email. And then she says, Conrad Black was my favorite. Massive, deep-cut disses to his two comrades on stage. He doesn't mince words. He was the most honest of all of them. For instance, when he said that when he was in legal trouble, Trump didn't lose his number. She said, and maybe the greatest spectacle, the fact that CBC called him a Nazi. She says, because that's totally true. Erin says, I'm looking forward to your synopsis on the show. And then we heard from Kyle. I wondered if Kyle was the big bearded fella in the Carhartt coat that came up to me about 3 feet away and just took my picture right to my face.
That's it?
I didn't. I just thought that was the one that I was like, I didn't know if he wanted a picture with me. I didn't know if he was like, I was like, that one was kind of a weird one.
Did he say anything?
But no, he didn't say anything. He just walked up and took it. And I thought, I wonder if that's Kyle, because Kyle had sent us an email saying, I'm going to find you at the event. He says, I want to shake your hand. This guy didn't shake my hand, but Kyle says I saw you there, but I didn't come say hi. He said, I don't know if my takes will differ from you or not. He said, but I was a little surprised that Conrad Black was the only one pushing election denialism on stage and the only one thinking that Trump will cakewalk to win that election in 2024. Tucker Carlson said he thinks that the 2024 presidential election is still up in the air. He also wondered whether or not, and this is kind of interesting too, he suggested, he didn't say it. He did not say it, but he implied and suggested that the Democrats might do something to get rid of, he used the word sinister. The Democrats might do something sinister to make sure that Joe Biden is not their candidate for the next election. Okay. So that was an interesting comment he made. Back to Kyle's email, he says, I think it's ludicrous to think this, that Trump will cakewalk to election. He says, most people know that it'll be tight come November. But to say that the show wasn't great with his wacky old grandpa vibes wouldn't be true. He said that maybe the only part of tonight I didn't like is because I like Nikki Haley and I see Biden beating Trump. He said, I liked optimistic takes on how human life has never been better, with under 10% of the world's population being in global poverty, how with America's backing, the West won the Cold War to provide more opportunity. Kyle says, while the True North speaker and the lawyer, John Carpe, were rallying the troops with their speeches, I loved Tucker Carlson's. He didn't come across as radical. It was funny, yet honest and truthful. It was funny. I agree with you, Kyle. He says he was there all night with his signature laugh. His laugh is just wild. And quips like mispronouncing Canadian cities. He went on and he talked. Remember that time, it was a few years ago, Tucker Carlson on Fox talked about the Canadian capital of Ottawa? Yeah. And then everybody was like, Tucker Carlson doesn't even know how to pronounce it. He goes, so here's the thing. Tucker says, I love mispronouncing Canadian cities, and it just drives people crazy. It just drives them nuts. He does it all the time. Drives them crazy. He says, until an Algonquin elder reached out to him with an email and said, it actually is pronounced Ottawa. He said in Algonquin. So Tucker Carlson takes this opportunity to say your prime minister loves dressing up in other cultures' costumes, but he doesn't even understand them. And then, of course, the crowd loved that as well. Kyle says his whole speech and tone was emblematic of what right of center people face and see with the risks of our current direction. He did not come across as far right, like his critics say. He seemed normal. I don't know about normal, but he explained why liberals are scared of him. He did. He said, and it's also cool to note that he's half Canadian, being from Nova Scotia. We can call him the Maritime Ted Cruz. Kyle says the Premier Danielle Smith had a beautiful speech, very well written. It was kind of an Alberta versus the detractors speech and the policy that she's implemented. It was really empowering to hear how we need to secure the freedom of thought and ideas and to be able to share them freely and openly. It's how we push forward through times of divisiveness. And I really see her becoming more premier-like. And the polling reflects that. That from Kyle. He says Jordan Peterson was good. He was way too Judeo-Christian in the psychology of it, sort of the Anglo-Christianity versus trans, the sort of the fear of God, and those who think that they are God commit genocide. He goes, it was getting a little heavy, but a lot of his points in the macro sphere would stand if the world was so binary, but it's not. He says, but he did make a good point that humans 50 years from now will advance more than humans advanced over the past 200. And with the technology being developed, the margin of error decreases where utopia is in reach, but a few points away is a dystopia. Kyle says, all in all, a little too much Americana Trumpist at the end, but understandable. It was definitely a Trudeau, Freeland, Guilbeault, NDP shitpost party. But overall, it was pretty good. And Jespo, I hope you enjoyed it. He says, sorry for the long email. How Canadian of me apologizing.
Nice.
Great email, Kyle. Great email, Aaron. Thank you. I don't think that it was an NDP shitpost. Nobody talked about the NDP except for Rachel Emmanuel at the very beginning with her Rachel Notley joke, which I thought was really funny. That's not relevant at this point. The idea of this is Alberta v. Ottawa, of Alberta versus the federal government.
Sure.
Right? And Tucker was talking about, and I'll wrap up my thoughts here. He talked a little bit about how Canadian cities don't have identities based on what they contribute to the country. He says, whereas in the United States, he says, that all the decisions are made in Los Angeles and New York and Washington, D.C. You know what those cities are all about. When you think of Pittsburgh, you know exactly what that city's all about. When you think of the state of Nebraska, you immediately think of what it contributes to the nation. He said, you don't have that in Toronto. He said, Toronto is built on banking and real estate. He said, and I don't think that that's a real or viable economy. He said, societies throughout history have not required or have not relied on commercial real estate and banking. He says, but Alberta is all about energy and food. He said, and you cannot function without energy and food. And he said, so you have a jurisdiction, he's talking about the federal government, or you have a group that basically contributes nothing. I mean, this is his supercharged language, obviously. But he says, telling a jurisdiction that gives the country everything how to operate, and the place goes crazy.
Of course.
Obviously a very pro-Alberta crowd. Obviously, I am pro-Alberta. But it was, that was kind of the tone of it. There wasn't a lot of like UCP versus NDP. Tucker Carlson's not getting in the weeds on the NDP leadership race. I mean, not a chance. That's not even on his radar.
Not at all.
But yeah, so that was kind of what jumped out at me.
Well, he knows what he's doing, and I said this before. I think at the heart of it, he's an entertainer, and I do believe this though. I believe he talks about all these things: closed borders, conservatism, infiltrating leadership in every corner of North America and the globe. But I don't really believe he wants that, because what's made him a 100 millionaire, Ryan, is the chaos. And if the chaos goes away, there's not much to talk about, especially on Carlson's Twitter show. So I don't in my heart believe that he really wants things to get better. And at the base of it, he's just an entertainer. He's someone who pushes buttons, and he makes a lot of money doing it. And whether you agree with that or not, I mean, I'll just say right now, you could get on your show tomorrow and say a bunch of crazy ththings, and we know these numbers and monetary would go through the roof.
When we launched Real Talk, we could have 1 million subscribers if we started talking about how the chemtrails and the vaccines are killing people.
But you got to go to bed every night with that,
I will say, I mean, he is, and I know I've said it before, and people are going to go, gosh, you don't need to say it 100 times. To watch that guy work, I mean, myself as a broadcaster, myself as an event host, a keynote speaker, this guy is very good at what he does. Like, he's probably the best public speaker I've ever witnessed personally. So that was it. Let us know what you think to talk at ryanjesperson.com. Tracy's absolutely correct. I mean, there's lots of stuff I'm missing, obviously. We were there for 2 hours, but Tracy says the Premier defended the Coots and says, how is this not a bigger deal? She did. She talked about how, what was the exact word? Talked about basically how it was unfortunate, suggested that justice was being denied for those four. That was an interesting statement on stage, Tracy. You're absolutely right. She says, the Premier's supposed to be about everybody, and this is Smith projecting her personal tin hat crap, which hurts a lot of Albertans. I don't know about that. I think when you're the premier of when you're the mayor, the premier, the prime minister, ministers, city councilors, school board trustees, you can choose what you want to attend and what you don't, and you can set your own schedule. And like it or not, Danielle Smith has earned the right to attend that event. And if you look at where a politician cares where their popularity comes from, unless it's months ahead of an election, they care about their base and their supporters. And yes, you've got to govern the entire province. There is no doubt about that. But as we heard in that robust debate last week here on the show, with Matthew and Peter going back and forth, Peter McCaffrey rather, and Matthew Hayes, debating whether or not the Premier should be on stage with Tucker Carlson. At the end of the day, I understand, as a former colleague of hers, exactly why she's doing it. She's doing it because Tucker Tucker Carlson's one of the biggest stars in the world because the exposure is massive and because she's speaking to her people. So there's no doubt about it. I can also guarantee you that her team of inner senior advisors probably did not want her to do it and probably didn't think that it was a great idea. By the way, no W. Brett Wilson on stage in Edmonton. I don't know about Calgary. I think he was on stage in Calgary. And while Theo Fleury got a shout out, as Dr. Dwayne Bratt, the political scientist, chirped at me on Twitter, which I thought was really funny, probably the only time that Theo Fleury has ever been cheered at Rogers Place or in a hockey arena in Edmonton. But big cheers for Theo Fleury last night, but they did not put him up on stage, which I thought was interesting as well.